Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, May 22nd, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Russia says that providing F-16s to Ukraine is a colossal risk. So the big news over the weekend was that President Biden decided while at the G7 summit in Hiroshima, Japan, that the US will sign off on the delivery of F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. So it's happening, it looks like. So a Russian official said on Saturday that the Western plans to provide Ukraine with American-made F-16 fighter jets bring colossal risks after the US announced that it would sign off on European countries delivering the aircraft. So this is Alexander Grushko. He is a Russian deputy foreign minister. He said, quote, "We see that Western countries are still adhering to the escalation scenario. It involves colossal risks for themselves. In any case, this will be taken into account in all our plans, and we have all the necessary means to achieve the goals we have set." End quote. So during the last day of the G7 summit, President Biden was asked about these Russian comments. He said he was asked, what do you think about Russia calling it a colossal risk? And his reply was that it is for them, referring to the Russians, kind of taunting them a bit. And the provision of F-16s, of course, marks a significant escalation of NATO support for Ukraine. The alliance previously ruled out providing Ukraine with Soviet-made fighter jets over fears that Moscow would perceive the move as NATO directly entering the war. But earlier this year, Poland and Slovakia, they took the escalatory step of sending the MiG-29 fighter jets, the Soviet-made fighter jets, and now F-16s appear to be on the way, although there's not a clear timeline right now on when they will reach Ukraine. So Belgium, Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands, they all have F-16s, and they've indicated that they're willing to send them, but they have not yet officially confirmed it. So we're not really sure exactly how many they're getting. I think Ukraine's looking for about 50 F-16s. But first, Ukrainian pilots need to be trained on how to use the F-16s, and estimates on how long that could take vary pretty significantly. So Colin Kahl, who's the U.S. Undersecretary of Defense and Foreign Policy, he previously told Congress that training Ukrainians on these planes could take 18 to 24 months, so up to 2 years. Other Pentagon officials have said that an expedited version of the training could take 4 to 9 months. So that's much shorter, much quicker. So who knows exactly how long it's going to take. And so far, the U.S. has said it's going to support the training. It's going to help with that, but they have not yet pledged to send their own F-16. So we don't know yet if the U.S. is going to send them. I'm guessing they will eventually if this keeps going on. And on Sunday, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, he said that President Biden has not decided on whether or not the U.S. will send F-16s. Sullivan said, quote, "I think given the numbers of F-16s that are currently available from the stocks of our European allies and the fact that based on the money Congress has given us, there are so many other priorities for systems to give, it may be that we focus more on third-party transfer, but the president has not made a final decision," end quote. So the efforts to provide Ukraine with these F-16s, this represents NATO's long-term plans to support Ukraine, as it could be years before the Ukrainian military can actually use the aircraft here. So again, it just shows like one of the last big stories I went over was that the U.S. is preparing for a frozen conflict, and in that scenario, they would continue arming Ukraine, turning it into, a de facto NATO member, which it is already. Just turning it into a NATO, even more of a NATO bulwark on Russia's border. And the risk of escalation, I mean, who knows at what point Russia might take a big step in response to these things. I think the attitude in Washington is, they haven't, done anything big. They haven't used a tactical nuke or bombed a NATO base in Poland yet. So let's just keep escalating support. It's just a lot of danger here. And there's a lot of lot to be said about the fact that Biden decided this while he was in Hiroshima, while he was in a city that the U.S. nuked, back in 1945 and vaporized. I know the estimate of the amount of people killed is between 70 and 140,000. I mean, it's just they go to this summit and they talk. We have another story about this, but they released a statement on nuclear disarmament, and then they go ahead and do things like this that are just making nuclear war more and more likely. All right, the next one here. Biden meets Zelensky and announces new military aid for Ukraine. So Zelensky flew over to Japan and Biden met him on Sunday on the last day of the G7 summit in Hiroshima, and he announced a new military aid package for Kiev that's worth $375 million. Biden said, quote, "I'm announcing the next tranche of U.S. security assistance to Ukraine, a package that includes more ammunition, artillery, armored vehicles to bolster Ukraine's battlefield abilities," end quote. So the funds for this new weapons package, it's being drawn from the $45 billion that Congress authorized to spend on the war in December. So there's been recent reports saying that the U.S. aid for Ukraine might be exhausted by midsummer or by the end of summer, and that the White House will have to ask Congress for more. But then there was that report the other day that the Pentagon discovered in error that overvalued weapons sent to Ukraine by at least $3 billion. And that means Biden could have more funds to work with to arm Ukraine. It sounds like a very convenient error, considering that they were having to start worrying about this money running out. But according to the Pentagon, this new $375 million package includes ammo for the HIMARS rocket systems, 155 and 105 millimeter artillery rounds, TOW missiles, Javelin, and AT-4 anti-armor systems, laser-guided rocket system munitions, demolition munitions, armored bridging systems, armored medical treatment vehicles, trucks to tow heavy equipment, logistics, thermal imagery, and spare parts. So the Pentagon said in a fact sheet that the package brings the total U.S. military aid that has been provided since Russia invaded Ukraine last year to over $37.3 billion. That's just in military equipment alone of what the Pentagon is telling us about. Could be more than that. And the Biden-Zelensky meeting came after the U.S. gave its approval for the European countries to give them those F-16s. President Biden said at a press conference that he told Zelensky, "We are going to begin training Ukrainian pilots on F-16s and other fourth-generation fighter aircraft." So that kind of sounds like, oh, maybe we could send them other types of planes, not just the F-16s. Biden might have been hinting at there. And he said, this is part of the long-term commitment to Ukraine's ability. So again, just they have their eyes on the future, years and years into the future. They want to be still arming Ukraine. All right, the next one here. So the other big news over the weekend was that Russia has taken all of Bakhmut, the city in the eastern Donbass, after a very long, bloody battle. So then on Sunday, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, the mercenary group, he said that they're going to get out of there and they're going to hand the city over to regular Russian forces on May 25th. So Prigozhin said in a message on Telegram, quote, "Wagner has made no advances. Wagner today captured no territory. We have captured all the territory we promised to capture, right up to the last centimeter. As we stated yesterday, we are handing over our positions to Russia's defense ministry. And on the 25th, we are leaving the conflict zone," end quote. So he's saying he did what he said he was going to do, which was capturing the city of Bakhmut. And for a while now, Ukraine has only controlled small areas in the west. And there were some Ukrainian gains, on the outskirts of Bakhmut. But even as that was happening, the Russian forces, the Wagner forces, were still making gains, block by block. It was a very slow, grinding battle, and it appears to be over. And it looks like this is a map from South Front of the military situation in and around Bakhmut on May 21st. And there's some clashes between Ukraine's forces and Russian forces, kind of on the outskirts of the city. But it looks like they control the whole city here. And Prigozhin and other Russian officials first announced the complete capture of Bakhmut on Saturday. Putin congratulated the mercenary force for taking the city. in a statement issued by the Kremlin on Sunday. So, Ukrainian officials are claiming that Ukrainian forces still control a portion of the city. They're claiming that, even though it seems very clear that they don't. Zelensky appeared to acknowledge that Russia captured the city in a press conference while he was in Japan. It was kind of, you can't really tell from the way it was worded, his response to a question. But then a spokesman for Zelensky said later in the day that the president has denied that Bakhmut has been taken over. But despite those claims, Ukrainian soldiers fighting on the front lines, speaking to the Kiev Independent, confirmed that Ukrainian forces lost the last high-rise buildings that they controlled in Bakhmut, and said that fighting was still ongoing on the outskirts of the city, but the city is completely under Russian control. And if you look at that Kiev Independent report, which is a very pro, Kiev media outlet, it's saying, that the battle's over. The battle for Bakhmut is over. The bloodiest battle of the war. Very long battle. I forget exactly how long, 200 and something days. The battle really started raging in August 2022. So it's been going on for a long time. And, a lot of people died, and it's just, it became known as the meat grinder. It's just a pretty horrible situation. And Zelensky has placed pretty significant value on Bakhmut. You see Western media kind of downplaying the significance of this, but Zelensky himself has said, we can't lose Bakhmut. He said not that long ago that if he lost the city, he would come under pressure both domestically and from his Western backers to compromise with Russia. So in the coming months, if Ukraine can't really launch a significant counteroffensive, I mean, they might come under more pressure. Some of the Western European countries might, kind of start to change their view. We'll see how everything plays out. All right. The next one here, a Republican bill in the Senate would scrap the New START treaty. So Senator Tom Cotton, very hawkish Republican senator from Arkansas, he introduced a piece of legislation last week that would formally accuse Russia of violating New START and call on the U.S. to withdraw from the treaty. So New START is the last nuclear arms control treaty remaining between the U.S. and Russia, and it places limits on the deployment of nuclear warheads and launchers. Russia suspended its participation in the treaty earlier this year, but has said that it will continue to abide by its limits. And as far as I know, it has not breached the limits. But, a piece of legislation like this, if it makes it through Congress, will guarantee that the U.S. and Russia will breach these limits and deploy more nukes. So in a press release, Cotton slammed President Biden for agreeing with Putin to extend New START for 5 years back in 2021. It's actually one of Biden's first foreign policy moves. New START was due to expire in February 2021. January 20-something, just a few days after he got into office, Biden got on the phone with Putin and said, let's extend this thing. And for a short time there, I had a little hope for the Biden administration's policies toward Russia, but that was very naive of me, clearly. So Cotton said in this press release, quote, President Biden should never have extended this treaty that has only made Russia and China stronger and America weaker. We should withdraw from the treaty and bolster our nuclear forces, end quote. So that framing is just complete nonsense. I mean, the New START treaty, it limited the deployment of nuclear warheads at 1,550, and then also limited the deployment of submarine missiles, ICBMs, and bombers that are, armed with nuclear weapons or could be armed with nuclear weapons. China doesn't even have close to 1,500 nuclear weapons. That they try to lump China into this, it's just nonsense. But the legislation would also place conditions on future arms control negotiations. So this is why this is a pretty dangerous bill. It would require any deals that place limits on the U.S. and Russia's nuclear arsenal to include China, even though China's arsenal is vastly smaller. And I think for China to really be interested in trilateral arms control with the U.S. and Russia, the U.S. and Russia would have to take some significant steps to reduce their arsenal. And that's not happening anytime soon. So if this passes, this would be bad news. And the bill would also prohibit unilateral reductions and prohibit the bargaining away of U.S. missile defenses. It would also ban the use of funds to implement the New START treaty or any future arms control agreements unless it meets the bill's required stipulations. So the bill has 10 Republicans co-sponsors, so that's a decent amount in the Senate. including Jim Reich, who's the ranking member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So, responding to the legislation, the Kremlin said that there has been no serious talks with the U.S. on arms control. And it's always important to point out that in the years and the decades leading up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from several arms control treaties with Russia, and that played a big role in the tensions. The Bush administration pulled out of the Anti-Ballistic Missiles Treaty, and the Trump administration pulled out of the INF Treaty and the Open Skies Treaty. All right. So the next one here, U.S. announces new sanctions with the G7 nations. So the U.S. on Friday announced new sanctions on Russia that were imposed in coordination with the Group of Seven, but they fell far short of what the Biden administration was hoping to achieve. According to the Treasury Department, over 300 sanctions were implemented on individuals, entities, vessels, and aircraft. The measures are meant to combat the circumvention and evasion of Western sanctions on Russia. But ahead of the summit, the U.S. was really pushing for much tougher sanctions on Russia that would have banned all exports to Russia, but they couldn't get that. The EU and Japan were against the plan. So these measures, it's just more sanctions on people that are apparently avoiding sanctions, skirting sanctions. And I believe it's mostly people and entities in Russia. So what do they care if they're going to be put under more sanctions? Just very symbolic. And I think it shows that, the sanctions haven't been working, to achieve what the U.S.'s stated goal is. It hasn't done anything to slow the Russian war machine. And there's no indication that these, sanctions are going to help that in any way. All right. But I know for the export ban, the main two parties that were against it were Japan and the EU. All right. The next one here, the G7 takes aim at China, but Biden expects a thaw in relations. So the joint communique released by the Group of Seven leaders during the summit over the weekend took aim at China over several issues, but President Biden said Sunday that he expects a thaw in relations with Beijing. So Jake Sullivan, he recently held a meeting with China's top diplomat Wang Yi, but 4 months beforehand, Beijing essentially cut off high-level contacts with Washington after Secretary of State Antony Blinken canceled a planned trip to China over the Chinese balloon that wound up over U.S. territory back in February. So President Biden noted that he and Chinese President Xi agreed to maintain high-level communication when they met in Bali, Indonesia last November. Biden said, quote, "And then this silly balloon was carrying 2 freight cars worth of spying equipment, was flying over the United States, and it got shot down, and everything changed in terms of talking to one another. I think you're going to see that begin to thaw very shortly," end quote. So for their part, China maintains that the balloon was a weather balloon, and we do know that it was blown off course due to unexpected weather. U.S. officials basically said that to the Washington Post. And the U.S. hasn't provided evidence for the claim that it was a spy balloon. So we still don't, really know. And while he's expecting a thaw in relations, President Biden has shown no sign of backing down on his hardline policies against China. These comments come as they're ramping up all this support for Taiwan in many different ways. And the Biden administration is also taking economic action against China. They've been ramping up sanctions, and now they're looking at screening U.S. investment in the country. And so at the summit in Hiroshima, the G7 leaders accused China of economic coercion. So they took aim at China in their statements. It wasn't as hysterical as the U.S. statements usually are, though. And while Biden was in Hiroshima, he held a meeting with the leaders of the Quad nations, which is the U.S., India, and Japan, and Australia. They announced some new cooperation with undersea cables and some other measures. And, the Biden administration views that increasing cooperation with the Quad, which some hawks in Washington want to be, the foundation for a NATO-style alliance in Asia, they think it's very important for their strategy against China. So a huge part of his visit to Japan, and you look at all the things were said, were about, countering China, containing China, however you want to put it. So I maybe hopefully they're going to keep talking, but a real thaw in relations, I doubt. All right. The next one here. So this is from Brett Wilkins. And this group, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, they have denounced the G7 failure to deliver on nuclear disarmament in Hiroshima. So, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which won the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize for its work on a landmark treaty banning nukes, and others, including survivors of the U.S. atomic bombings of Japan on Friday, criticized a group of 7 joint statement on disarmament as missing the moment to make the world safer from the threat of thermonuclear annihilation. So, as the G7 summit got underway in Hiroshima, leaders of Japan, Germany, Italy, Canada, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, that's the G7, um, they reiterated their belief that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. So, out of those 7 countries, the US, the UK, and France have nuclear weapons. And so, while this statement acknowledges the unprecedented devastation and immense human suffering the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki experienced as a result of the atomic bombings, and they reassured the G7 commitment to achieving a world without nuclear weapons, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons lamented that it failed to commit to concrete measures toward that goal. They didn't announce any actual steps, and they even emphasized the importance of reserving the right to nuclear weapons. So this group said in a statement, quote, "The G7 are trying to sell decades old and insufficient initiatives as a new vision, when at the same time they themselves are complicit in the rising nuclear risks and promoting mass murder of civilians as a legitimate form of national security policy," end quote. And that's true. President Biden did not offer, he didn't even offer any comments when he visited this memorial. And of course, he didn't apologize. Obama was the first U.S. president to visit this memorial in Hiroshima. He didn't apologize. Ahead of the trip, Sullivan said Biden's not going to apologize. So this is really just all for show. And I think it's insulting to the people that are still alive and, of course, the people that died, because, again, they gather here in Hiroshima to advance these policies that are making nuclear war more likely. And they actually, there's some quotes in here from survivors of the bombings that are criticizing the G7's approach here. And there's a lot of protesters. So again, this symbolism with them holding this summit in this city, it's pretty powerful, I think. And it made a lot of people, not happy. All right, the next one here, the US, the UK, and French commanders transit the Hormuz Strait. So the Middle East-based commanders from the US, Britain, and French navies transited the Strait of Hormuz on a US warship on Friday in an unusual show of force aimed at Iran. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet said that its commander, Vice Admiral Brad Cooper, made the transit with his British and French counterparts aboard the guided missile destroyer USS Paul Hamilton. The show of unity near Iran's coast came after the White House announced that the U.S. was increasing its military presence in the Persian Gulf following Iran's seizure of 2 oil tankers. Before Iran seized the 2 tankers, the U.S. seized a ship in the region that was carrying Iranian oil and stole its cargo. So, important context that the U.S. did that first. And the U.S. has a history of taking Iranian oil and gas shipments using sanctions enforcement as a pretext. And tensions between the U.S. and Iran are very high. Something I think a lot of people are not paying much attention to, because there's a lot of other concerning things going on. But the situation is pretty hairy between the U.S. and Iran. And as I went over last week, the U.S. has proposed to Israel to conduct joint military planning on Iran, whatever that means. And Israel is always threatening to attack Iran. So the situation just isn't very good. And it's just kind of a weird, this is clearly just a message to Iran, showing the U.S., Britain, and France, doing this little transit. But that's it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have a good one from Ted Galen Carpenter. Is NATO crowding the Russian bear into a nuclear corner? One from Judge Knapp, the feds and their copycats. One from Ryan Turnipseed over at the Mises Institute. The U.S. followed a policy of foreign intervention long before World War II. This is a good article, and it has a great timeline here of U.S. intervention in other countries, going back to 1890 in Argentina. So it's a interesting piece here, and it looks like it has some useful information. You can check out from William Hartung, U.S. foreign arms and training programs are out of control. That's over at Responsible Statecraft. And our spotlight is from Jim Bovard, the Biden crime family and our corrupt foreign aid. That's over at the Libertarian Institute. But that's everything for me for today. I hope everybody had a good weekend. You could always support the show at antiwar.com/donate. You could share the show around, comment and like and subscribe. All that stuff really helps. That's it for me for today. I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for listening.